Like an operatic performance, this lecture has a 5-minute overture.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second of a three-part lecture series, How the Humanities Can Save the Planet, delivered by Sir Jonathan Bate. It's my favorite color, so I am Mark Leisure. I'm Professor of English, Senior Sustainability Scholar at GEOS, that is the Global Institute of Sustainability, and the Acting Director of the Environmental Humanities Initiative at ASU. The EHI was inaugurated in 2015 with the last appearance of Jonathan to ASU, and also a visit from Mary Evelyn Tucker, the co-founder of the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale University. Across its brief existence, the EHI has created an undergraduate environmental humanities program, has held conferences and workshops, both national and international, has made connections that stretch literally across the world, and has emerged as a leading program in the field. And as I look around the room, an effort that includes many of the people in this room. So before I go through the formal thanks, Immediate thanks to Laura Kubi, I think back in the back there, who's with sustainability, Kristen LaRue Sadler, who's in the English department, and Bruce Matsunaga, who's behind the camera. And I want to thank them for their relentless efforts, both for the program and for everything they do for us on a daily basis. I also want to thank Amy, who introduced me, who's poured a ton of energy into this program, and Pina over at the Tempe Changing Hands bookstores. So I do have to acknowledge the support of a fairly broad group of people at ASU. So thank the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Dean of Humanities, the current director of the Institute for Humanities Research, and finally, of course, the Dean of the whole shebang, Patrick Kennedy. It's their support that has allowed me the great pleasure of teaching with Jonathan this semester in an environmental literature and film course. Finally, I think he's on the way. We couldn't have done this without the enthusiastic support of Gary Dirks, who is the director of the Global Institute of Sustainability. Now, it's my great pleasure to actually introduce Jonathan, which I've only had that chance to do once before, and it's fun. So Jonathan is arguably one of the most prominent literary scholars in the world. He was appointed to, and I think the first time I went to visit him, he was the King Alfred Chair of English Literature at Liverpool at the age of 31. Then he, in a weak moment, agreed to be chair of that department as well. Jonathan, that'll teach you. He also became one of the youngest ever fellows of the British Academy at the ripe old age of 42. And he's only the 5th person in history to be knighted for services for literary scholarship and distinguished contributions to the rank in humanities. He's the author of 12 highly acclaimed books, many of them prize winners and many others, and he has many other accomplishments, but let me just run down a quick list. 2 are mentioned available after the program, so if you'd like to grab a copy and have Jonathan sign, he'll be happy to. The first one I read was Shakespeare and the English Romantic Imagination, and it was followed immediately by Romantic Ecology, Wordsworth in the environmental tradition, which was the occasion that we met for the very first time in 1980. He's written The Genius of Shakespeare, The Song of the Earth, also available. My favorite biography in the world, John Clare. The list goes on and on. Jonathan has performed massive service, really, for all of us in humanities. He is a man of great accomplishment, and he's funny too, as it turns out. So without further ado, let me go ahead and welcome to the mic Sir Jonathan Bate.
Well, thank you all very much for coming out tonight and listening to a few thoughts about the future state of the planet as opposed to the present state of the Union. I will not attempt to predict or prophesy what will be said in that address, but the question of prediction and prophecy will be part of my theme tonight. This is the second in a series of 3 lectures in which I meditate on some of the ways in which I believe that the humanities must come to the table as we debate the great environmental crises facing our world today. In the first lecture, I spoke about the past. I spoke about the origins of environmental crisis, but also the sense that so many cultures have that once there was a better time, a golden age, a Garden of Eden, a time when humankind was at one with nature. And then at some point, there was a fall, a break, a rupture. And I talked about why we need those stories of a lost paradise. That was looking back. Tonight I'm looking forward. I'm going to talk about the way in which all cultures also seem to have stories about ending, gloomy prognostications. And I'm afraid this is going to be a rather dark lecture. So if you want a little relief afterwards, you can indeed pick up a copy of my jointly edited anthology of poetry for stress relief. So the first lecture, how we got here, the second, where people fear we're going, and then in the third one, back on campus in Tempe, I'll be talking about some of the ways in which the humanities might help us to change the road ahead. Past, future, present, a narrative structure. And one of my key arguments is that the debates about sustainability need the humanities because it's the humanities that give us narratives. We can turn to the scientists to explain phenomena such as climate change, to engineers to seek geo-engineered fixes for them, and to social scientists and economists to work through the economic consequences and to try to influence policymakers. But above all, we need the humanities to provide us with the stories, the narratives. The particular story of the end of the world seems to have special significance within the Judeo-Christian tradition, and I'll be talking quite a lot about that tonight. I sort of began with the book of Genesis, and inevitably tonight we'll be thinking about apocalypse, about the other end of the Bible. In my little overture, I put two clips together, some extracts from a remarkable production of Wagner's Ring Cycle, which ends with Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, and I'll return to that at the end, together with the opening sequence from Francis Ford Coppola's film Apocalypse Now, which was accompanied by that song from The Doors, This Is the End. Apocalypse Now is, of course, a reworking of a very famous story of human darkness, Joseph Conrad's novel from the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, Heart of Darkness. Many archetypal stories imagine life as a pilgrimage, a road to salvation. Think of Chaucer and his Canterbury Pilgrims, or think of the book that in my country for 200 years was the most read book, save the Bible, and that was John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, the story of a pilgrimage towards heaven, towards the New Jerusalem. What Heart of Darkness and its spin-off Apocalypse Now offer is a counter-narrative, a journey not towards the light, but a journey into the heart of darkness. Both works suggest that the road of geopolitics is nearly always a dark one, a power play that involves imperial overreach, which inevitably brings not only human cost, human suffering on a great scale, but also direct or collateral damage to ecosystems. The story behind Heart of Darkness is that all empires are transient. Famously, it begins on the River Thames with the narrator, Marlowe, a seaman. They look out across the mudflats of the Thames, and Marlowe says, suddenly, and this also has been one of the dark places of the earth. The place that by 1900 was the epitome of civilization, the capital of the empire that ruled 1/3 of the globe. Even when I began going to school in the 1960s, you could still see maps on the wall of the classroom in which 1/3 of the globe was colored pink. Then Marlowe goes on to speak of the time when this too, London, was one of the dark places of the earth. I'm not going to read the whole of this passage, but it's a very famous passage where he imagines a Roman legionary coming to the distant reaches of the Roman Empire and finding, quote marks, savages there, and having a sense that he's landed in a swamp, that he's in a wilderness. And at the end of the passage, Conrad's narrator, Marlowe, says there's no initiation either into such mysteries. He has to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also detestable. And it has a fascination too that goes to work upon him. The fascination of the abomination. You know, imagine the growing regrets, the longing to escape, the powerless disgust, the surrender, the hate. And it's, of course, that process that we then see in the course of the narrative of the voyage up the river in Africa into the heart of darkness, and the meeting with Mr. Kurtz, the man who began with a mission to civilize and ended with the horror, with the oppression, with the abomination. So too, when Coppola reworks that in his film, the figure of Kurtz, who has gone rogue in Vietnam. The horror. All empires are transient. The Roman Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire will be transient. Narratives help us to understand that story, and images help too. If we think of the extraordinary story of the personal rule of Leopold II in the Belgian Congo, which is what Conrad was alluding to in his novel, a time where I think the only private colony in history where the entirety of the Belgian Congo was given over to the control of King Leopold, and in order to build his own wealth, he introduced forced labor, primarily, of course, for the extraction of rubber. This was the time when the invention of the bicycle, and not long after that of the motor car, led to a huge demand for rubber. But it wasn't only rubber. In the case of Conrad's Kurtz, it was ivory. And a photograph such as the one you see on the left of the imperialist and his hoard of ivory is as powerful as the many words of Conrad's story. And similarly, probably the most famous war photo of the 20th century, the photograph by Nick Ut of the young girl Kim Phuc at Trang Bang in 1972, where of course she has torn off her clothes because of the napalm. And if we then think of Vietnam, we think not only of napalm, but also of Agent Orange. We think of the destruction of an environment as well as the destruction of communities. All empires come to an end. Those of you who were at my first lecture, I did an analysis, you'll remember, of Thomas Cole's series of paintings on the progress of empire. That sense of beginning with an Arcadia, a kind of paradise, a Garden of Eden, progressing through to the building of cities, the building of empires, but then the destruction of empires, and what is then left is ruins. So in Cole's extraordinary sequence of 5 huge canvases that you can now see in the New York Historical Society, the same scene through history, a temporal pattern. That image of ruins in the fifth and final of Cole's painting was characteristic of an obsession with ruins in the late 18th and the early 19th century. As the Ancien Régime came to an end in France in 1789, as the American Revolution imagined a new world, an end of British rule, so writers became fascinated by this idea of political change, of the end of empires. It's one of the characteristics of some of the more advanced thinkers of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, that they began to think of history in terms of cycles rather than something that was permanent or necessarily progressive. The great Italian thinker Giambattista Vico, in a book called The New Science, early in the 18th century, argued just that societies rise and fall in a cyclical sequence. And so it was that towards the end of the century, a French thinker called Count Volney published a book called The Ruins of Empire. You can see there the English translation of it, the idea of the ruins and the revolution of empires. All empires eventually come to an end in revolution. And Volney links that to what he calls the laws of nature. nature is seen as something that inevitably brings decay, brings a cycle of change. Volney's book is actually picked up in the woods out of a dropped satchel by the creature in Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein. And it's from reading Volney on the ruins of empire that the creature begins to understand about language, about change, and about human history. And of course, it was Mary Shelley's husband, Percy Shelley, who, when he saw the broken fragment of the head of an old statue of the Egyptian emperor Ramses II brought to the British Museum, that he was inspired to write his poem about the hubris of empire and the inevitability of its end. Imagining a traveler in an antique land finding a great statue of a ruler who imagines that his rule, we might say his Reich, would last 1,000 years, but it's broken into fragments. And on the pedestal, these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains," says Shelley, "round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away," the sands of the desert reclaiming at the end of empire. Things coming to an end. All cultures have stories of catastrophes. All empires come to an end, and the environment, the decay of the environment, plays a large part in it. The distinguished environmental historian and geographer, Jared Diamond of UCLA, has written a remarkable book called Collapse, looking at many, many different cultures across the world and through the centuries, and asking what causes a culture to collapse. Now, of course, the answer is there are multiple causes. War can be one of them. Overextension of trading ambitions can be another. The arrival of disease as a consequence of trade can be another. But Diamond argues the absolute key one is overuse of the land, environmental change, climate change, and in particular, he argues, societies succeed or fail, they are resilient or they collapse, according to how they deal with the threat, the reality of environmental change. Classic example that he takes, and although it's one where different historians do debate the relative importance of different factors, there is no doubt that environmental decay as a result of overpopulation exceeding the carrying capacity of the environment. Classic example, of course, was Easter Island. And there is the first surviving representation of those Ozymandias-like decaying statues of the ancestors on Easter Island. That was a painting by the resident artist on Captain Cook's voyage, where Western contact with Easter Island first took place. Our own stories of destruction, catastrophe, collapse of society are often, of course, told through Hollywood, and they are very often centered in the city of Hollywood, in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, the home of the Disaster movie. A powerful book by the social critic, sociologist, and cultural commentator Mike Davis is called Ecology of Fear, Los Angeles and the Imagination of Disaster. A book that almost seems to rejoice in earthquakes, giant rats, fires. There's a famous chapter of it called "The Case for Letting Malibu Burn." Tsunamis, you name it. Davis's argument is an interestingly political one, because he suggests that the Hollywood disaster movie, which often involves some form of invasion, is nearly always underpinned by race. And The Swarm, 1970s Killer Bee disaster movie, is probably quite a good example where he is right. The fear of a swarm coming to overrun our city does seem to be a deep form of paranoia within the white American, the imperial imagination. This actually predates Hollywood. You can go back to find a lot of popular fiction of the early 20th century where the so-called yellow peril is seen as the thing that is dangerous. And you could also see something similar in British fiction of that time. If any of you are fans of Sherlock Holmes, you'll often find in Sherlock Holmes stories that some kind of curse or evil event or an object that brings death tends to come from the East. It's always that fear of invasion from the East. I see the power of that argument of Davis's, but I think there is a problem with the argument, which is that it underplays the force of the idea of a natural disaster. I can see how you could argue that an apocalyptic film about an alien invasion can, at some level, be linked to an anxiety about aliens in the sense used by the US Immigration Authority. But I don't see how a catastrophe film based on fire, flood, famine, natural disaster can be read in those racial terms. And I think, in a way, Davis's focus on the socio-politics of apocalyptic narratives of ending, perhaps do a disservice to our understanding of the importance of narratives about natural disaster. And indeed, I might even go so far as to say, although there will be many fellow academics who will shoot me down on this, that by the same account, the way in which our cultural studies in the last 20 years or so have focused so much on questions of racial and gender identity do run the risk of leaving out of the discourse the relationship between human societies and our wider natural environment, and to lose that sense of the wider ecology of which we are all a part is distinctly untimely given our current environmental crisis. So, LA stories, fire, tsunami, earthquake. A kind of biblical idea perhaps lies behind that. Nature strikes back at the unnatural city, a form of divine punishment. I will now show you how an anonymous enterprising YouTuber has, I think, quite provocatively mashed up an archetypal 1970s LA disaster movie and a late 1980s alternative rock anthem that mixes wryly detached irony, postmodern bricolage, and a kind of throw your hands in the air, there's nothing to be done because it's all coming to an end, so just have fun.
You've got something against religion.
R.E.M. meets earthquake. Notice at the end of that clip how the dam is burst in a moment of inundation. The sense that water will come and consume us all is at the heart of many of these stories of catastrophe. Intriguingly, though, many of the ancient myths of flood are stories that don't end with total apocalypse, but rather can suggest a future renewal. In the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, in many ways the foundation of Western literature, we find an archetypal story of a flood that involves a heroic figure building a boat and then surviving a flood, and then when the calm comes, making a sacrifice, and a promise of new life is given by the gods. That ancient myth was replicated, of course, in both the ancient Greek, the classical tradition, and the Jewish, the Hebraic tradition. I want to say a little bit about the classical version of the story. The figure of Prometheus is often used as a metaphor for humankind's invention of technology. Prometheus, you remember, steals fire from the gods. The gods are angry at his hubris. He ends up being chained to a rock, and a vulture perpetually gnaws out his liver. The Promethean ambition is an archetype of the human desire to aspire to a kind of divinity through technology. Interestingly, that novel by Mary Shelley, in which the central character reads Volney's Ruins of Empire, is called Frankenstein or the New Prometheus. The scientist is often represented as a Promethean figure. But Prometheus has a son called Deucalion, and Deucalion is a good man. He and his wife Pyrrha are virtuous characters in a time of decadence. Ovid provides the most beautiful telling of this story in the first book of his Metamorphoses, the great repository of the myths of ancient Greek and Rome. And what happens is that because Deucalion and his wife are virtuous, they are allowed to survive a flood that inundates the planet and destroys the decadent people of the Brazen Age. They eventually land on a high mountain, and then the waters recede. And I'm just going to read a few lines from a fairly literal English prose translation of Ovid's account of this story. They find, as the waters recede, they find a temple to the god Themis. And they approach the sanctuary, kiss the cold rock with trembling lips, and say, if the gods' wills soften, appeased by the prayers of the just, if their anger can be deflected, Themis, tell us by what art the damage to our race can be repaired, and help, and bring help, most gentle one, to this drowned world. And then the goddess Themis gives a curious reply, oracular speech. She says, leave the temple, and with veiled heads and loosened clothes, throw behind you the bones of your great mother. For a long time, they stood there, unable to understand what she meant. But then Pyrrha, Deucalion's wife, breaks the silence. She says that it will offend her mother's spirit to scatter her bones. But then Deucalion realizes that the bones of which the goddess is speaking are not human bones, but the stones of the earth. And they throw stones over their shoulders, and those stones are magically metamorphosed into people. and a new race is created. Hard stone turned to soft, warm life. A reversal of the process you get in many of the stories in Ovid's Metamorphoses, where human beings are turned into natural forms. And it provides an extraordinary sort of sense of hope. There's a wonderful description of the stone being warmed, coming to warm life. Shakespeare, of course, loved Ovid. The Metamorphoses was his favourite book. His wonderful moment, perhaps the most life-affirming moment in all of Shakespeare, when this stone statue of Hermione comes to life at the end of The Winter's Tale, is at one level an allusion to another story in Ovid, where the artist Pygmalion makes a statue and falls in love with it, and then he kisses it and it comes to life. But it's also, I think, a reference to this animation, this bringing back to life. Leontes in the play has frozen Hermione out of his life, but then with the forgiveness of the end of the play, she comes back to warm life. And there is actually a reference to Deucalion within the play. You can see, obviously, that the well-known biblical version of this story, the Noah story, has a similar kind of pattern. The good man who survives in his ark, the waters recede, and then the reconnection with nature, if you think of the sending out of the dove, and then the sense of a new covenant, the rainbow, of course, being that covenant in the story. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are narratives of how catastrophe can be followed by renewal. But there is nevertheless a great deal of doom and gloom within the biblical tradition. And usually there is someone who will deliver that message of doom, a prophet. This image, again from the early 19th century, same kind of period as the Thomas Cole that I talked about in my last lecture. This is an image by the great British romantic artist John Martin, who painted many large and often apocalyptic scenes. And this is a scene from the book of Daniel, the prophet Daniel in the Old Testament. It's Belshazzar's feast. Daniel is, if we can get the clicker working. Oh, he's the guy in black on the table. There he is. Can everybody see Daniel here? Yeah. Prophets often wear black. Can't get him. He's got his hand in there. There he is. Standing on the table, delivering his prophecy of doom. Elsewhere in the book of Daniel, of course, it's Daniel who interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So the book of Daniel set when the Israelites are in exile in Babylon. At the back of the John Martin image, you can see the half-finished Tower of Babel. That, again, the Babylonian Empire, an empire that is bound to fall. The interpretation of the dream is where essentially Daniel narrates the idea of the fall of empires. He speaks of various kings, various monarchies, each of which will decay. But then he says, after the 4 monarchies have decayed, and they perhaps correspond to those 4 ages in the classical tradition that decline, the golden, the silver, the brazen, the iron. But then Daniel says a 5th monarchy will come, and that will be the monarchy that will endure forever. And of course, in the Christian tradition, that was picked up with the idea of the millennium, the return of Christ, the establishment of heaven on earth. A group who actually called themselves the 5th monarchists were among the radical thinkers of the English Revolution of the mid-17th century. And here I've got one of their pamphlets, a brief description of the 5th monarchy or kingdom that shortly is to come into the world. The monarch, subjects, officers, and laws thereof, and the surpassing glory, the unity and peace of the kingdom, when the kingdom and dominion and the grace and pride of the kingdom of the whole of heaven will come to the people. one of the main impulses underlying the English Revolution of the 17th century, the first revolution that actually involved chopping off a king's head, was the idea that that fifth monarchy, the New Jerusalem, was coming upon the earth. A very influential historical work by a man called Norman Cohen is called The Pursuit of the Millennium. And he shows how right through Western history, within the Christian tradition, again and again, revolutions have been impelled by the idea that the millennium is coming, that the old order will go and a new eternal order will be established upon the earth. The contemporary British philosopher John Gray has argued indeed that that pattern of millenarianism, of in some senses welcoming the end, welcoming the catastrophe, because it's a moment when a new world will begin, underlines the utopian visions of modern politics. This is how his remarkable book, Black Mass, Apocalyptic Religion and the Death of Utopia, begins. He writes, "Modern politics is a chapter in the history of religion. The greatest revolutionary upheavals that have shaped so much of the history of the past 2 centuries were episodes in the history of faith, moments in the long dissolution of Christianity and the rise of the modern political religion. The world in which we find ourselves at the start of the new millennium is littered with the debris of utopian projects, which, though they were framed in secular terms that denied the truth of religion, were in fact vehicles for religious myths." So his argument is that the French Revolution, with its proclamation of year zero, a new beginning, the Russian Revolution, subsequent political revolutions, are in fact buying into that same myth as the myth of the millennium. Now, I want to suggest that there are huge dangers in these kind of utopian myths. And in this, I'm in agreement with John Gray. Equally, it seems to me, there are huge dangers in the myth of salvation in the next world. If the idea of salvation in this world is an illusion because all revolutions eventually turn to violence, all new beginnings end with catastrophe, then the idea of salvation in the next world is equally toxic. If one reads the book of Revelation, or indeed certain passages of the Quran, then there's a sense that we need not care about what happens to this earth of ours, because we who are saved are destined for a better place in paradise. Bring on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, seen there in an engraving by Albert Dürer. Or indeed, in the Islamic tradition, bring on the jihad, because the martyr will find 72 houris in paradise, an ancient medieval Islamic image of the beautiful houris of paradise. These surely are dangerous myths. And indeed, the Christian pattern of a story from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, from creation to apocalypse, has been particularly powerful and could perhaps be problematic in the way in which we think about crisis today. One of the most powerful works of literary criticism of the last century was a book by Frank Kermode called The Sense of an Ending, in which he meditated on the way in which so many of our fictions in the Western tradition depend on an interest in temporal structure, going from beginning to middle to end. And Kermode suggests that that is a structure kind of underwritten by the Christian idea of from Genesis to revelation or apocalypse from beginning to end. Kermode was interested in asking in that book, why is it that we are obsessed with endings? He actually created the idea in a course of lectures that he gave at Bryn Mawr, and it was in 1965. So of course it was at the height of the Cold War, where there genuinely was a sense of impending human-produced apocalypse. But Kermode's book still has great value in reminding us that the idea of an ending, the idea of the end of the world, is a narrative structure. It's a structure created by human culture, by a set of cultural predispositions, and indeed religious beliefs. And one of the arguments of the book is that in the end, the reason we're obsessed with all these narratives of ending, of the end of the world, of catastrophe, of apocalypse, is because in a way what they are doing is standing in for a narrative of our own death. Our lives have a beginning, a middle in which we are now, and will have an end in the form of death. The apocalypse narrative as a form of displacement for a personal narrative about death. So he says towards the end of the book, the apocalypse is not imminent in the sense of something that is really going to happen, because every time someone said it's going to happen, they said it was going to happen in the year 1000, they said it was going to happen in the year 2000 or the year 666 or the Mayan apocalypse of 2012, and it never does happen. It is not imminent, but it is immanent in the sense of it is within us. It's a very interesting argument. So let me try and summarize what I've been saying about the apocalypse narrative and link it to how it can help us think about our current state in the planet. The prose of the apocalypse narrative, a reminder of the law of entropy, of all things coming to decay. A method of dealing with our own temporality, our insignificance, an admonition against hubris, against excessive human pride, and perhaps a moral imperative. In the words of the great German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, you must change your life. If you don't, things will end badly. But the cons, the dangers of the apocalypse narrative, it encourages the illusion of the possibility of an earthly paradise regained. That utopian idyll of the French, the Russian, most recently the Venezuelan revolution. It encourages too the illusion of a heavenly paradise achieved, which might lead to a diminution of care for the earth. And then above all, and I think most problematically for us today, the apocalypse narrative encourages the illusion that because our world did not end last time, it will not end this time. The prophet of our time is the elderly British naturalist and TV presenter, Sir David Attenborough, who you will remember back in December addressed the UN Climate Change Conference and described climate change as our greatest threat. The greatest threat in thousands of years. It could lead to the collapse of civilization, the extinction of the natural world. Right now, we are facing a man-made disaster on global scale, our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. The prophet David. The problem with prophecies of ending is that people can say things didn't end before. This is all exaggerated. Maybe this is fake news. You remember the famous radio broadcast of H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds, in which allegedly there was mass panic across America as people assumed that the Martians were really invading. Scholarly research has actually shown there was no mass panic. There were about 8 people in one small town who panicked. But that didn't stop a deluge of press on the subject. We need to be wary of fake news. We need good journalists who will give us the facts. I do worry or wonder whether the doomsday rhetoric of journalism is potentially a hindrance rather than a help as we educate ourselves, our publics, our politicians, our children about the state of the planet. I pulled from The Guardian yesterday, a third of Himalayan ice capped doomed, finds report. Even radical climate change action won't save glaciers, endangering 2 billion people. I find in The Guardian today, is climate change far worse than we realize? David Wallace, author of a new book, The Uninhabitable Earth, and so on. Is there a sense in which, rather as charities sometimes find that you get donor fatigue when there are just too many causes to help, is there a danger that the doomsday rhetoric around climate change will be counterproductive? What kind of narratives are most helpful for us as we live in the end times, as we live in the latter part of the Anthropocene? We must recognize that we have brought the end of nature. There is now no part of nature that is not affected by human activity. It will bring the end of us. But the world will not end, only the world as we know it. If we are to slow the entropy, we maybe still need bad dreams to goad us. But the dream of utopia must be kept in the past. Paradise lost, the golden age. Modernity's most prescient dreams of the future are surely the dystopian ones, whether that be the visions of George Orwell in 1984, of Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, or of the tradition of dystopian writing, which goes back again to the early 19th century, to this period where urbanization and climate change began. I think, for example, of a remarkable French poem called Le Dernier Homme, The Last Man, by de Grenville, a French writer, or of Mary Shelley's novel, The Last Man. And more recently, of ways in which writers have tried to address the sense of an ending. Alan Weissman's remarkable book that imagines what the world will be like without us, how quickly nature will repossess our cities. And a book that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in my third talk, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, a book that perhaps picks up on that notion that we need to think about the relationship between our own mortality and our planet's future. And of course, there is a very powerful tradition of dystopian fiction within the world of film. A few clips here from Ridley Scott's film Blade Runner, taking us back to Los Angeles, not a Los Angeles destroyed by earthquake or fire, but a city transformed and a humankind transformed, in which the revolutions in technology, artificial intelligence, the arrival of replicants has irredeemably changed the nature of humankind. There are, of course, several different versions of the film Blade Runner. The director was never entirely satisfied with it. And those versions vary as to whether or not there is some element of hope at the end. And it does seem to me that in a way the most valuable apocalyptic narratives of ending, are those where there is hope. And I want to end by just telling you about two of them. The Drowned World by the novelist J.G. Ballard. I think time will tell eventually that Ballard is the most important English novelist of the late 20th century. Ballard, most famous, of course, for his autobiographical novel, Empire of the Sun, about his experience being interned in China during the Second World War, which was made into a Spielberg movie. But his more distinctive mode is a kind of serious science fiction. The Drowned World, which he published early 1960s, exactly the same time that environmental awareness really took off, as it is published the same year as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, begins with the image of London completely drowned as a result of global warming. And it tells the story of how humankind is changed as a result of the heating of the planet and the drowning of the world. And what is interesting about Ballard's treatment of it is that he links a climate narrative and a geographical and an ecological narrative to a psychological narrative. What happens in the course of the novel is that because of the heating of the earth, creatures start growing. Alligators grow into dinosaurs, and a new kind of Triassic age takes over. And then at the same time, humankind reverts back to its primitive self. It's a very powerful narrative, but there is an element of resilience, because at the end, the central character goes into the heart of darkness. He doesn't give up. He continues on his quest. He remains human. He's willing to fight on. Similarly, to end, perhaps the greatest of all myths about beginnings, endings, and new hope. Richard Wagner, in his cycle, The Ring of the Nibelungen, took a whole range of ancient Norse myths, myths of origin, myths of the gods, myths of the humans, and put them together into an extraordinary narrative of the process whereby humankind takes from nature. At the very beginning of the cycle, gold is taken from the River Rhine. It is fashioned into an instrument of power by the evil dwarf Alberich, who then enslaves his workers. Love is renounced in the name of power. George Bernard Shaw, of course, famously saw that Wagner's ring cycle was in some sense an allegory of 19th century capitalism, the rape of natural resources and the exploitation of the worker in the name of capital. But what contemporary directors of the opera have seen is that just as much as a social story, a social myth, the ring is also an ecological myth. The extraordinary production by the Catalan theatre group Fura del Baus, which was staged in Valencia between 2008 and 2010, of which I showed you some extracts at the beginning, and I'm going to end by showing you the end of, took the view that what the ring is really about is, in the words of the director Carlos Padrisa, the degradation of nature by technological man. But what the operatic production achieved was a sense of the technology of the theatre restoring a kind of beauty, a kind of aesthetic to nature, and in so doing, giving an image of redemption. Götterdämmerung, The Twilight of the Gods, ends with the idea that the gods must die. Valhalla, heaven, must burn, but there will be, through the music, redemption through love. There's a little musical motif which occurs at various points in the ring and finally occurs at the end, the idea of redemption through love. After the apocalypse, redemption through love, but not redemption in Valhalla, redemption here on earth. What I'm going to talk about in my third and final talk is some of the ways in which the arts and the humanities can perhaps offer us glimpses or moments of redemption. The These are the Rhine maidens as they take back the ring. That's Hagen, Alberich's successor, who eventually is taken back into the Rhine. Thank you very much.
Hello, and I don't want to steal from your next presentation, because I have a lot of the questions that come up from that. Former journalist from The Guardian, writing about sustainability, telling us climate stories, and doom and gloom gets more readers. The only other approach that we found over the years was something about the future of tech, some increasingly wonderful tech innovation. But I guess my question is, data doesn't work, facts don't work. Lots of these different narratives, I've tried them and experimented globally with what works for an audience. So I'm curious, maybe in your next presentation you will cover this, but what works? What is a new approach that we could do in telling this climate narrative that reaches more people?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly the dilemma that I wanted to explore, because we are, as it were, caught on the horns of a dilemma in the classical sense, because, as I say, as I've suggested, if you can plug into hundreds, if not thousands of years of stories about doom, apocalypse, the end of the world, people will turn around and say, well, it didn't happen last time, it won't happen this time. Whereas, the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence is that it will happen this time. So how can you break that narrative? How can you avoid doom fatigue? I think one of the answers is around the power of individual images. it seemed to me that the photograph of the polar bear stranded on the tiny ice floe had a particular kind of effect, rather as the Vietnam napalm photo had a particular kind of effect. So I think individual images, and similarly, if one thinks about the refugee crisis, for all the stories about the refugee crisis, in the end, the thing that really woke people up was the single image of the little boy's body on the beach off the Greek island. So the power of the individual image is one thing. And then I also think that this is what I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. Narratives that are absolutely based in experience and in particularity seem to me to be the other key, because as I said in the first lecture, one of the reasons why I see the humanities as being so important in thinking about sustainability is, as you say, just putting the data out there, speaking in scientific terms about the number of particles of carbon in the atmosphere. For your typical consumer of media, it doesn't mean anything. But equally, at the other extreme, the grand narrative of disaster just looks like another bad Hollywood movie. So that's why I think particular images and particular narratives, stories that come close to home, seems to me the key. But we all have different homes, and so, and again, this is going to be one of the arguments of my third talk, that it may be that we need to just keep returning to that old green slogan from the end of the last century: think globally, act locally. Begin with local stories, local problems, and then it can work outwards. That's not a full answer, but a beginning of one, I hope. So thank you, but a very, very key question. Yeah.
We have lots of myths and stories of crash and redemption. Do we have any we can use where the crash was avoided and the civilization rebuilt itself in time to not have to start from scratch?
Oh, that is a great question, isn't it? As it were, the narrative of the near miss. I can't think of any immediately off the top of my head, because as you say, I mean, as I was sort of spanning through history, it tends to be either the myth of the complete disaster, or this idea of the kind of, if we may say, the phoenix myth of rebuilding from the ashes. But you can't get the renewal without the disaster within this mythic pattern. And that's where Commode's argument about how narrative particularly thrives on an idea of ending is very, very powerful. Because if you didn't have, this is like in any movie, you've got to have your big moment of jeopardy. If you don't have that, then you don't get that kind of satisfaction when it comes to the end. Anticlimax doesn't get readers and viewers excited. So I think there's a problem there, but I shall try and think of some good examples of that before my next talk.
I noticed that you were mostly using Western myths, Western stories.
Yeah.
So if you want a story of a near miss, you need to come to the East. We are really good at that.
You are, and indeed, you've anticipated a major thread of my third lecture. That as I said in this lecture, this temporal narrative, this kind of Genesis to Apocalypse narrative, is very, very distinctive of the Christian, the Western tradition. And what I'm going to do in the next talk is exactly look to the east, where of course so many of the foundational myths are cyclical, and where there isn't that longing for a realm outside the earth. And I'm going to suggest indeed that the West has much to learn from the East, that by looking east and also by looking inward, we are going to find some solutions. And one of the figures who's going to be at the center of that talk is, of course, the kind of founder, really, of environmental thinking in your country, Henry David Thoreau, who took so many of his ideas from the East, as well as from the Romantic tradition of my country. So do come down to Tempe and next time. And yes.
Another nice thing about those stories is that I also get saved.
Yes.
It's not
Yeah. And again, it's a very well, it's a kind of obvious point that narratives of reincarnation are very, very different especially within the Buddhist tradition, as opposed to the Christian idea, where Christ is a unique incarnation, and where salvation is somewhere else. So yes, looking east. Thank you. My voice is going, but let's have one more question before I collapse, like a defunct civilization. Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to think how to frame this. So I was a student in the School of Sustainability, and one topic that comes up very often is communication, science communication, public buy-in, what have you. And it seems to me often that a weakness of our approach is we often present solutions to communities basically on a silver platter. And so all you have to do is make these few changes, but in a lot of my research that involved trauma, it seemed to me that the more powerful message, which you find in the entire Western religious tradition, is the redemptive path. So what do you see as the use or the function of guilt in these narratives? Because there's a certain power in blame, right?
Yeah.
Because we made this happen, so
Yeah.
we have the possibility.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly the kind of dialectic that I was trying to suggest, where I was talking about the pros and cons here, because clearly many apocalypse narratives are guilt narratives, and if one sort of thinks of the kind of Christian sheep and goats narrative, the idea that at the end time the good will be saved and the bad will be damned, which has had a massive influence on Christian art and iconography and thinking for 2,000 years. The role of guilt, admonition, the moral imperative is a huge part of that. And obviously there is a value to that, but there's also huge danger in that. And similarly with the redemption narrative, that it seems to me this, I'm sort of powerfully persuaded by these arguments that the idea that we can achieve utopia or get to paradise is an illusion and not actually a very helpful one. What we need is precisely a narrative of redemption that is more contained, that is here upon the earth, but that doesn't claim to be universal. It seems to me that, in a way, one of the things underlying all these images of apocalypse is a sort of sense that something, a sense of the universal, but the universe, but a kind of universal transformation of our societies is never going to be possible. The one thing that is universal is the inevitability of death and of ending. How we accommodate that is part of what I want to talk about next time. And if you want to sort of follow the line of thinking, I've been very struck by the little book that actually Mark recommended to me, a remarkable book by Roy Scranton, a little short book by an Iraq War veteran who's now a scholar. And it's called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of Civilization. And it absolutely blew me away. It was one of those books I thought, damn, I wish I'd written that book myself. It's so good. So that could be your homework for next time. But thank you all so much for coming.